Hello friends. Today we will recap 2023 thriller film, Tetris. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. In 1988, Hank Rogers, a video game promoter from Bulletproof Software, attends a convention to promote the game Go, which is described as a more challenging version of chess. Unfortunately, there is little interest in the game, and the person he hired to assist him becomes distracted by another game. Disappointed, Hank approaches the booth showcasing Tetris, and against his initial reservations, he becomes instantly hooked on the game. Later, Hank meets with Eddie, a bank manager, and confides in him about his obsession with Tetris. He reveals that he has secured the rights to distribute Tetris on PC, game consoles, and arcades. Hank then proceeds to explain the history of Tetris, starting with its creator, Alexei Pajitnov. 4 years prior, Alexei was a programmer for the Russian government but also developed games on the side. With the help of his co-workers, Tetris evolved from a simple concept into a colorful and popular game. 2 years later, Robert Stein of Andromeda Software discovered Tetris and obtained the licensing rights from Alorg, a Russian organization. Stein then pursued an international licensing deal with Robert Maxwell of Mirasoft, with the condition that he receives royalties. Continuing his narrative, Hank describes his recent visit to Nintendo HQ in Japan. He showcases Tetris to the CEO, Hiroshi Yamauchi, who is impressed by the game. Despite receiving a $500,000 offer to buy the rights, Hank declines the offer, instead proposing a partnership with Yamauchi, drawing a parallel to iconic duos like Mario and Luigi or Zelda and Link. Hank then seeks a $3 million loan from Eddie to produce Nintendo cartridges and arcade consoles. Eddie agrees, with the condition of increased interest rates and Hank offering his house as collateral. Back at his apartment in Tokyo, Hank discusses his deal with his wife Akemi. Initially concerned, Akemi realizes their children are engrossed in Tetris, resulting in a peaceful household. Particularly, their eldest daughter Maya shows a strong interest in the game. Hank receives a call from Kevin, Robert Maxwell's son, who informs him that the arcade rights to Tetris have already been sold to Sega in Japan. Furious, Hank returns to Nintendo to discuss the situation with Yamauchi and request advanced residuals. Yamauchi invites Hank to meet his colleagues in Seattle. Hank travels to Seattle and meets with Minoru Arakawa, the president of Nintendo, and Howard Lincoln, the VP. They introduce him to the Game Boy, an upcoming handheld console set to be released with Super Mario Land. However, Hank successfully convinces them that Tetris should be bundled with the Game Boy instead. He also expresses his intention to secure the licensing rights for the handheld version of Tetris. Following that, Hank decides to fly to London to meet with the Maxwells, who are engaged in a heated discussion with Stein after he confronts them about the missing payment. Hank expresses his interest in purchasing the handheld rights but doesn't receive a clear response from the Maxwells. Once Hank and Stein depart, Kevin raises concerns about money being taken from employees' retirement funds, but Maxwell dismisses the inquiries and remains focused on acquiring Tetris. As Hank and Stein leave, it appears they strike a deal for the handheld rights. Subsequently, Arakawa and Lincoln contact Hank and inform him that Stein is selling the handheld rights to Atari for $100,000 as retribution against the Maxwells for their failure to pay him. Undeterred, Hank decides to travel to Moscow himself to visit Alorg and secure the rights personally, despite the warnings from Arakawa and Lincoln about the risks of dealing with communist Russia. Upon arriving in Moscow, Hank encounters Sasha, a young woman who becomes his translator. Despite her warnings about the potential trouble they may face by entering without an invitation, she leads him to Alorg. There, they meet the president of Alorg, Nikolai Belikov, and Hank begins explaining his business intentions. With Sasha translating, Hank discovers that Alorg had only licensed the PC rights and not the console or handheld rights. Hank presents Belikov with a personal copy of Japanese Tetris, but Belikov suspects it is an illegal copy. Despite Belikov's initial order to leave, Hank manages to persuade him to meet again and discuss the terms of the deal. As they leave Alorg, Hank encounters suspicious KGB men who instruct him to leave the country. Meanwhile, Kevin arrives in Moscow and meets with Valentin Trifonov, a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party and the head of the Department of Foreign Trade. The Maxwells believe that their connections to Mikhail Gorbachev provide them with an easier path to acquiring Tetris. The following day, Hank and Sasha return to Alorg, where they meet Alexei Pajitnov for the first time, alongside Trifonov and his associates. Trifonov accuses Hank of engaging in illegal practices, such as using a false tourist visa, while Alexei remains skeptical of Hank's intentions. Belikov informs them that the arcade rights to Tetris were never sold to anyone. Stein and Kevin also arrive separately, attempting to meet with Belikov, while Hank examines the signed contract and realizes that Stein has stolen the arcade rights. Belikov provides Stein with a new contract for the handheld rights. Finally, Alexei offers Hank and Sasha a ride back home. Kevin meets with Trifonov once again, discovering that they were being surveilled during his meeting with Belikov. Trifonov admits to Kevin that communism in Russia will soon come to an end and expresses his desire to honor their agreement. Behind Kevin's back, Trifonov is being bribed by Maxwell into helping secure Tetris. That evening, Hank pays a visit to Alexei's home and shares a meal with him and his wife, Nina. Initially skeptical, Nina suspects Hank of stealing Tetris, but he manages to prove his honesty and genuine intentions to them. Alexei then presents the original version of Tetris to Hank and allows him to play the game. Suddenly, they hear a knock at the door, which alarms them, fearing it might be the KGB searching for Hank. To protect him, Alexei and Nina hide Hank. However, upon discovering that it is only a neighbor requesting salt, Alexei attempts to persuade Hank to leave. Nevertheless, Hank convinces Alexei to accompany him outside so they can continue their conversation. Alexei takes Hank to a club where like-minded individuals who aspire for independence from the Soviet Union gather. They all engage in a joyous celebration, dancing to the tune of the final countdown, and Hank starts to form a bond with Alexei. Unfortunately, the KGB has been monitoring Hank and capturing photographs, leading them to locate his family and threaten Akemi and their children at her workplace, coercing Hank to return home. Other KGB agents find Hank, assault him, and steal his pants, which happen to be Levi's. He returns to his hotel room, only to find it ransacked before Sasha arrives. Sasha explains the reasons behind the KGB's pursuit of him and attempts to convince him to give up, even surprising him with a kiss, but Hank reminds her of his marital status. Later, Trifonov encounters Alexei along with his sons, Dmitry and Peter, subtly threatening Alexei with a fate similar to his father's. Meanwhile, Hank contacts Akemi and instructs her to reach out to their lawyers. Both Hank and Stein separately return to Elorg. Stein expresses dissatisfaction to Belikov regarding the new contract but eventually relents and signs it. Hank confronts Belikov about the events that have unfolded and proposes a new deal, requesting $25,000 up front and royalties and 25 cents for every copy of the game sold. Hank, desperate and financially strained, estimates that Tetris could potentially sell up to 20 million copies, which would result in $5 million for Belikov. Subsequently, Belikov meets with Trifonov outside, who suggests that Mirasov should acquire Tetris. The two then meet with Kevin, during which Belikov states that Mirasov can obtain Tetris if they wire $1 million within a week. In a private conversation with Hank, Belikov discusses the possibility of accepting Hank's offer within the same week, providing him with a letter of intent to sign. Hank encounters Alexei, who joins him in a taxi to ensure they are not being followed. Alexei shares the story of his father, a university professor who ruined his career by signing a letter of protest on behalf of a colleague who was imprisoned for selling his book abroad. Alexei reveals that Sasha is a KGB agent specifically targeting Hank due to the perceived threat he poses. They observe Sasha conversing with Trifonov. Subsequently, Alexei accompanies Hank to an airport. Hank disappoints Maya by missing her school concert, breaking his promise to attend. Meanwhile, Maxwell meets with Arakawa and Lincoln to ensure that Mirasov secures the rights to Tetris. At the same time, Trifonov, following Maxwell's instructions, has one of his men attack Belikov. Back at his apartment, Hank receives a fax notifying him that he has been removed from the Tetris deal. Additionally, he receives a threatening photo of him and Sasha kissing, which could be used to harm his family. Akemi and Maya arrive, and while Akemi scolds Hank for missing the concert, he seems more preoccupied with losing the deal and everything they have. This causes Maya to run to her room in tears. Belikov pays a visit to Alexei at his apartment and informs him that Tetris will be given to Mirasov. He tells Alexei that he will be removed from his position as the head of Elorg unless Alexei can rectify the situation. Belikov hands Alexei a letter of intent to fax to Hank, which Alexei does from his workplace. Around the same time, Kevin discovers his father shredding documents and asks for the $1 million required for the payment to Elorg, but Kevin admits that they don't have that money. After receiving the letter, Hank returns to Nintendo to confront Arakawa and Lincoln, presenting them with the document. Hank discovers that Atari has stolen Nintendo's patent and is selling Tetris cartridges. He accuses Stein and the Maxwells of lying and reveals that the letter had expired the day before, rendering Atari's rights to Tetris invalid. Hank convinces Arakawa and Lincoln to accompany him back to Moscow to finalize their deal before the Maxwells take further action. Alexei learns that he has been fired from his job and witnesses people repossessing his belongings. He also finds Trifonov conversing with Dmitri and Peter, who appear to be threatened with harm. Trifonov contacts Maxwell to continue their negotiations, but Sasha discovers Trifonov attempting to pursue his own interests rather than prioritizing the country's welfare. Following this, Stein confronts the Maxwells and punches Kevin in the face for secretly going to Moscow and attempting to secure the Alorg deal behind his back, thereby depriving him of his payment. Maxwell reads the documents and plans to travel to Moscow with Kevin to personally negotiate with Gorbachev, working against Hank. Upon his return, Hank tries to find Alexei, who refuses to see him due to the losses he has suffered as a result of working with Hank. Not far from them, Trifonov and his henchmen learn about Hank's return and hurry to Alorg. The Maxwells arrive at Alorg first to finalize their deal, but Hank, accompanied by Arakawa and Lincoln, arrives shortly after. Maxwell instructs Belikov to sign the agreement, but Hank realizes that the Maxwells have no money to fulfill their obligations to Alorg. Belikov sees through their deception and refuses to sign. Maxwell attempts to attack Belikov, but Belikov retaliates with a well-deserved headbutt. Belikov proceeds to sign the deal with Nintendo and orders Hank, Arakawa, and Lincoln to leave Moscow immediately. Trifonov confronts Maxwell, exposing their illicit dealings in front of Kevin and Sasha, after realizing that they have lost the contract. Trifonov relentlessly pursues Hank, Arakawa, and Lincoln, but just in time, Alexei appears to pick them up and drives them to the airport. A high-speed chase ensues as KGB goons chase after the four men. They manage to reach the airport and hastily board the first available flight. Trifonov assumes they are heading to Tokyo and boards that plane, only to discover that they are on a different one. Sasha arrives and arrests Trifonov for treason. Hank returns to his apartment in Tokyo and sets up a makeshift stage to make amends for missing Maya's concert. He apologizes to her in Japanese, and she performs a show for him while he watches alongside Akemi. Hank also shows Maya the $5 million check made out to Bulletproof Software. Later on, the Game Boy is released, featuring Tetris, which quickly sells out in Japan before its arrival in the United States. Gorbachev resigns from his position, and borders in Europe begin to open up. Hank sends Alexei his personal copy of the Game Boy. Eventually, Alexei and his family move to the United States, where they are welcomed by the Rogers family. Hank and Alexei warmly embrace each other. The concluding text reveals that Hank Rogers and Alexei Pajitnov collaborated to establish the Tetris Company. Robert Stein continues to license games but never recovers from the loss of Tetris. Robert Maxwell embezzles over $900 million from pension funds and accumulates a debt of over $5 billion, leading to the collapse of his media empire. His death remains shrouded in mystery. Kevin, implicated in the theft, is later arrested and declared bankruptcy but is eventually acquitted of fraud charges. In 2014, Hank appoints Maya as the new CEO of Tetris. With over 1 billion units sold, Tetris remains one of the most beloved and popular games of all time. The end.